Sustainable minds, sustainable minds, sustainable minds with IPSF.
Hello, Pharmily. Welcome back to our World Earth Day podcast series, The Sustainable Minds with IPSF. In this podcast, we will discuss the topic of the relationship between environment and humanitarianism with our guest today, Christophe Hodder, who is the environmental advisor to Somalia at the United Nations Environment Program. Hi, Christophe. We're so glad to have you here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Before we start the podcast, can you please give us a brief introduction about yourself and your work?
Yes, of course. So my name's Chris Hodder, as you said, or Christophe Hodder. I am the environmental advisor to Somalia for the United Nations Environmental Program. I've been in post around about 8-9 months now. And my role is very much around two sides of the sort of issue. One is looking at environmental mainstreaming across the UN country team, about providing expert and technical advice, about trying to work on coordination, and about data and evidence, and around working with the government to try to mainstream and look at all the issues of climate change and the environment in a broad sort of sense. But the other side of my work is I'm the first climate security advisor for a UN peacekeeping mission. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to link climate change and conflict. And so I do a lot of work around making the links between what's happening in the climate, climate-induced events, and competition over natural resources that's leading to conflict.
I see. Okay, that's amazing. Thank you for the interesting introduction, Christophe. So yeah, you're working with the government and also with the UN regarding climate change and disaster management, which of course involves humanitarian response. Yeah, so today we're talking to the right person, and yeah, we're going to talk deeper about it. Okay, the first question I want to ask is, can you give us an example of humanitarian issues caused by climate change or any other environmental health problems? And what do you think is the link between environment or environmental health issues and humanitarianism? Yeah, I think it really relates with your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big things I'm doing at the moment is I'm coordinating a task force on flooding and drought, so the extremes of water. And at the moment in Somalia, it's very much the drought season, but actually we're going into the rain, into the GU rain seasons at the moment as well. So and what's interesting is that actually, of the 2.9 million people displaced in Somalia last year, 75% of all those 2.9 million people were displaced because of climatic events, so flooding and drought. So it used to be over the last 10 years that conflict was the major driver of displacement, but actually now climate change and climatic events are the major cause of displacement in Somalia, and we're seeing that more and more regularly. And actually, if you look at projections, and UNEP and other organizations have done a lot of these, and the International Panel on Climate Change have done a lot of projections. We're on track for a 4-degree rise in Somalia, or no, sorry, not 4 degrees, to be at 4 degrees temperature by 2080. So which means that we're going to have huge amounts of issues of drought, because it's going to be really, really, really hot in the sort of central and upper regions, and it's going to be very wet in the sort of basin areas in the Shabelle and the Juba River, and so that's only going to increase. And so we've got 2.9 million people displaced. I think the projections are that's going to be hugely increased, and we could end up with if you look at the urbanization rate, and this is the interesting part. Is it displacement or is it urbanization? Because now with climate change happening, the traditional livelihoods of traders, livestock, agriculturalists are all changing now. So everybody's moving to the coastal cities because they're looking for alternative, different pieces of work. They're looking that the land now it's too arable or it's too dry to be able to grow and to have livestock. So it's becoming a huge issue. And actually, then you can see that that's not only in Somalia; it's across the world now. I think that countries that are bearing the brunt of climate change are going to have huge issues of migration, huge issues of urbanization, and that's going to cause big problems for developing countries in terms of international migration and international security issues. And we're also seeing, for example, in Somalia, we're trying to do it, but we think there is a link between recruitment into militant groups and the fact that there's no alternative livelihoods because of climate change. So we think that actually recruitment into militant groups and security is only going to increase. So I think that the humanitarian issues are only going to get worse and worse. And what we're realizing is actually you can't, like the flooding and the droughts, you can't just do a year-on-year humanitarian response. So there's the same response. So the humanitarian response plan this year was 1.9 billion. And so we're going to be doing sandbags, we're going to be doing food relief, we're going to be doing a lot of work like that, but without looking at it from a nexus approach. And when we talk nexus, that's the humanitarian, development and peace actors all working together to try to solve the issues of drought and flooding. So for example, rather than putting sandbags down, let's look at, can we plant the right trees? Can we look about the ecosystem of the river completely? Can we look at nature-based solutions? Can we try to think around integrating peace keeping, stabilization approaches to conflict settings with the humanitarian and the development, because we can't just spend $1 billion each year. We need to think more on terms of longer term impacts of river management, but from a nature-based solutions rather than concrete solutions.
I see. So yeah, I agree that there are a lot of humanitarian issues caused by the flooding and droughts. It's because of the climate change. But so I've ever read this article it's in the UNEP website that Somalia has been under like unrest for the last 25 years. Is there any effect because of that unrest to the climate change, or it's just because of the urbanization and the change of the livelihoods of the people that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and the instability and the conflict is not 100% with climate change. So conflict and instability is a complex issue, and so we're not, in no way are we saying that climate change is the main cause of conflict. What we're saying is that it's a contributing fact to the conflict. And yes, there is instability and there is conflict in Somalia, and that is to do with interest, it's to do with tribalism, it's to do with clanism, it's to do with social determinants. There's a lot of issues that link that. So what we're saying is only that climate change and the climatic events are just a multiplier effect to that conflict and the humanitarian issues. So it's not, it's not one thing, it's just a complex part. But what we're seeing is that we think that the competition over the natural resources, and actually if you look back at a lot of these conflicts, you can see that a lot of those the base parts of the conflicts, for example, in Hirshabelle there's this conflict that is around grazing rights and grazing lands, and actually during the droughts and the floods that exacerbates the conflict because there's less land during the droughts, or there's less land during the flooding, so it becomes more aggressive. And so natural resource competition and natural resource management is actually a key part of or an underlying part of the conflict, and so they are only going to get exacerbated by climate change.
Yeah. Wow, that's a very interesting insight for me. You're right that the climate change has caused the land degradation, the droughts, and that exacerbates the competition between the natural resources, and finally it causes a worse humanitarian crisis. Yeah, that's a huge insight for me. My next question is, can you provide us an overview of key environmental health infrastructure or aspects and how this can be affected after a disaster and during a humanitarian crisis? Well, I think you have described a bit about it. Is there anything you would like to say about it again?
So I think that I think we haven't really covered the whole issue of humanitarian, human health, and the links between human health and climate change. And so globally, we know, for example, you can start seeing that there's a lot of reports out there. We're still to understand it, but the zoonotic diseases, the diseases coming from animals or ecosystem degradation, and some people are saying we think it is, but until the full research is done, that COVID itself is also a zoonotic disease from coming from animal. And so there's a clear link between ecological destruction and human health. And actually what we can see is that if you degrade the ecosystems, and the ecosystems that we live in provide food, they provide water, they provide a balanced area for humans to live in. And once we degrade that and we take that imbalance, that's where diseases are going to increase. So we already know that in the last 40 years we've had 30 or 40 new diseases, including Ebola, including COVID, including Legionnaire's disease. All these are new diseases that have come around, and there's a clear link between ecological destruction and the new disease creation. And so unless we take into account in human health and human health management and the human health infrastructure, the environment and the ecosystems that we live in, we're not going to, that's only going to increase those disease increases. The also the ability to respond and the ability for us as our, in terms of our natural ability to fight disease is only going to, degrade. And I think that it's really, really key that we understand that, specifically, you're your pharmacists and everybody to realize the links between the ecological side of human health and the prevention of disease spread. We need to make sure. So when we talk about environmental systems, so we need to think around it from a whole ecosystem and production and human systems approach, right? So when we look at the river, we need to look at the river from its ecosystem. So the protection of the banks with the right type of trees and roots. We need to look at it from the agricultural point of view. So rather than breaking the riverbanks for irrigation canals for agricultural purposes, we've got to make sure that those riverbanks, those canals are actually built into the whole ecosystem, so that we're not breaking a riverbank and we're not, creating floodplains in areas where there's human populations. And then vice versa, we also, for example, displaced sites or trying to look at solutions to human displacement, we need to think around, let's have the ecosystem. So think about planting the right type of trees, thinking the right type of, Somalia uses charcoal, so for cooking purposes. I think a lot of countries use that. So we can't chop trees down for charcoal use, because we need to think around the ecosystems around it. Because otherwise, if you chop the tree down, you're actually contributing to soil erosion, which is then contributing to flooding. So there's a cycle there that is really, really key.
Yeah. And if you use charcoal, then it will create air pollution as well. And then, if you cut the trees, then they cannot absorb all of these air pollutions. Yeah, so they're all like interlinked. Yeah,
it's totally interlinked. And then it's the same within the water, for displaced camps, but also everywhere. Unless you think around the waste management, for example, you're going to pollute the riverbanks. You're going to then stop the fishes and the natural ecosystem in that river, and then that's going to pollute the river in a longer term, and then you won't be able to drink it. So the whole system is totally interlinked, and I think that we need to totally understand that from the systems approach.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it will pose an impact towards us humans as well, that especially that you mentioned about human health, because if there are like disasters, there will be an opportunity for some infectious diseases, new infectious diseases to emerge, and then it will affect human health. And talking about poor sanitation, poor hygiene, or poor access to water, people are suffering from cholera, diarrhea, and parasitic diseases. So actually it's just interlinked, and we need to really have an awareness about it. Thank you for the insight, Chris. And then So you're working, am I right? You're working on the policy level, right? Like you're an advisor to the government regarding their policies, regarding the policies. More, so it's for Somalian government, isn't it?
Yeah, so I
Mhm.
work, well, I work at multiple levels. I work at the policy level, but I also work at the community level. So I try to work with local NGOs, local CSOs,
Oh,
try to work with, international organizations. I try to partner, coordinate. And so my role is a bit, at all levels. I directly work and support on the policy level to try to look at what type of policies that we can support the government. So, for
yeah.
example, we're doing they've just passed through Parliament a National Environmental Management Act, and that is an act that tries to set out, and it's quite forward thinking in some ways because it puts out the right to a right to a clean environment, and so it actually sets the stage for legislation against polluters and organizations that, or private companies and other things that do that, and it also sets out the right to a clean water. So it starts the steps towards the environment as a human right, and so once we've set those out, then you can start litigating and you can start setting up protection and
Yes.
legal systems that look at protection around the environment as part of the system. So that's what we're definitely trying to do. And equal to that, the government has just looked at putting out an environmental impact assessment guidelines. So all new investments and companies have to follow environmental impact assessment guidelines, including the new oil exploration that's going on. So we're looking at supporting the government on a social and economic environmental impact assessments tools, which looks at how the exploration itself, but also if there's any issues of oil spills or any leakages, that the companies understand the issues around the environmental impacts of those.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very important because usually factories will like spill some chemicals and they will affect the human health. Yeah, that's very important. So yeah, I
Yeah,
have.
and I don't know whether you know whether you heard about this, but in the 1990s there was a big issue of European companies dumping waste and on the coast of Somalia, and actually that then came up in a tsunami, and then that waste came into ground. So but that was a long time ago. But the protection of the ecosystems as well as another thing we're looking at in terms of like protecting coral reefs, protecting mountain ranges, and trying to look at those things. So that's another part of the policy side we're looking at.
I see. It really resonates with where I am living right now in Indonesia. Like there are a lot of things going on, deforestation and everything, and there are a lot of unprecedented disasters also coming here. So I totally agree with what you said. But I am curious. I have a question for you. So the government has already established all of these policies that environment is a kind of human right, and then they will set up legislations to protect the rights of people getting access to proper water, or like just to protect the environment for people to live. But usually the problem is on the implementation of the regulations it's themselves. So I've ever read an article again in Kenya there that environmental activists were protesting against the building of a railway because it's destroying the Nairobi Conservation Wildlife Park, and so I'm just like curious. I think there's two sides when I don't know, this is just a personal perspective. There's two sides when the government is trying to decide or make a policy. Like one side is that they're considering about the acceleration of the economy of the people, human civilization. They build the railways, the buildings, but at the same time they're also sacrificing the nature. But we cannot see the effects in the short term. We can only see the effects in the longer term for the future generations. And maybe the government is like prioritizing this short term benefit first, and they are sacrificing again the nature, and sort of, I'm not like blaming the government or something, like maybe there are some considerations among them, but I'm just curious, what do you think, how do you think the government should respond if they have to make a decision out of these hard options?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly difficult, and I think that part of the problem is the capitalist system that we have set up, and the way that modern democratic systems seem to work. That that you, on the one hand, you have to work on the short term because you won't get re-elected and you won't get the system done, but on the other hand, you want to try to work for the best of the country, so you want to try to make these ecological and environmental decisions. So I think that part of the problem is the systems and the capitalist system that we work in. So there are other models out there, and trying to move to something a bit more of a circular economy, looking at ways of working in a different democratic system that works at short term, but looking at the long term in the short term decisions. So there are other models out there, and economic plus governance systems, but we have to live in the world we're living in. So I do think it's a very, very difficult situation in question. But I think at the same time, for example, like folks, so what you were saying about the Kenyan model, I would say on the one hand, I think that yes, economic development is really important. But on the other hand, they have one of the most advanced sort of environmental policies in Africa and the world in terms of its protection of natural parks and areas. It also has a huge positive side on the renewable energy. I think 75 or 78% of its energy production is all renewable. So it does have a great environmental policy. It does have a lot of progressive work. But at the same time, there is that push and the drive from the economic side. So I do see that as well. So really, it's about trying to balance that out, and trying to deliver something that works really well. And so that railway you're talking about actually cuts across the Nairobi National Park, but at the same time it's raised up, and so you can actually drive in, and I've been several times, you can drive in and you can actually see lions around the bottom of the railway. So it's actually it's actually quite beautiful to see. And so trying to have some sort of interlinkages or work that works for both sides, the economic development and for the environment, is a win-win. But it's very difficult, and with population increase, it's only going to get worse. So I think that having something around, my wife works in reproductive health, and looking at looking in the issues of population and the choice issues around population is really important, and I think that we need to include that into the health and environmental as a key part of this.
I see. Wow, that's a very huge insight for me. I don't know if you know about this, Chris, but I just want to share my experience living in Borneo, in Kalimantan. I don't know if you know the island Kalimantan.
I have. I've been to Borneo as well.
Yeah, it's a very beautiful island. There are a lot of rainforests, but there are cuttings of rainforest, deforestation, because they're replacing it with palm oil. And I've ever watched this documentary movie. It's very interesting that orangutan mothers, because the deforestation eliminates quite a few species, including orangutans especially. But it's very interesting that orangutan mothers, they need 10 years, I don't know, 10 years or 10 months to teach their children on how to eat the right fruit and disperse the right seeds, so that there is a diversity of trees in the rainforest. And when these trees are cut down, being changed to palm oils, I'm just so sad. And I cannot really imagine how it affects the climate. And the forests are gone. They cannot absorb the air pollutants that we have. And each year I don't know if it's each year or each quarter of year, we always have this holiday, because there is a huge smoke in our country, in our city, and we cannot really breathe. So we're like at home, and even the smoke can still go inside our homes. So it's just so terrible here in Borneo. Yeah.
It's pretty awful. And before here, I lived in Nepal, and Nepal as well had, we had to almost sellotape the windows closed because the pollution was so bad. And I think that more and more now, the urban cities pollution is going to be, the major cause of death. And I think in terms of like the UK, I think there was a groundbreaking legal case recently that someone had died because they lived next to a road and they had lung issues and it was related to pollution. And actually they then brought a case against the government around pollution. So I think hopefully that this litigation type approaches will lead to, people realizing and so what you were saying about the orangutans and the palm oil, behavior change has to happen in developing countries. So the supply has to change. So we need to realize that huge amounts of our soap, huge amounts of our chocolate all has this palm oil in it, and we need to think about changing the behaviors. But I think part of that is legislation. So I think in the UK and in other countries, we need to litigate against or legislate against products that are harmful to environment in other countries. I think that should be a really key part of that. I also think that pollution has to be a central part of this, and the government in the UK has just signed up to even better targets, which I think is really great. And I think that other governments will follow suit. And with the new Biden administration, I think it's great. So, and then I think that with the COP around the corner, I think that there's a great opportunity here, but we have to take it now, and we have to take it seriously. And if you listen to what Greta is saying, what everybody's saying, we really need to do this now. And I think that it's about the youth, it's about the young people coming up and saying, hold on, this is not right. We may not have a planet left in 50 years, and we need to think about this seriously. And I think that absolutely key to that is the young people really making a voice and saying, you've got to stand out there and you've got to do this. So strike on the Fridays, make sure the governments listen. And I think that that's exactly what should happen.
Yeah. Youth's voices are totally powerful, and we should act locally. That's the most important thing, to act locally, act in communities, help those people in need. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have this campaign, is to raise the awareness of the young people to act and to advocate for these issues. Yeah. So this is my last question. So do you think that COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation in the areas where you're working right now, where the environmental health issues are happening?
I mean, it's interesting. I think that if I went for a bicycle ride, I ended up getting lost and ended up in some informal settlements in Nairobi yesterday, and it was just really interesting that actually there's a big difference between social distancing and the economic, and so COVID in developed countries and COVID in developing countries, because the economic issue actually is a bigger driver than COVID. And so if you can't put food to mouth, then you can't, you need to work and you need to do this. So that's where people mainly are doing it. So I actually think that there hasn't, in a lot of developing countries, there hasn't been that bigger impact on COVID. It has been made an impact on, the government and the working and the legal side. But I don't know how much it has made a big impact on some of the sort of day-to-day working of what's happening on the ground in developing countries. And I think that I'm hopeful that it has led to a big change more in the developing countries, because I think that the realization that you don't have to fly, you could do meetings like this on Zoom or Skype, that has made a big change. I think that hopefully people have realized also that you don't need to travel and go into big offices all the time. You can do a lot of things at home and work at home. I think hopefully that will make a big changes. And also, the stories of the environment, coming back now, because there's been less people out, there's been less things happening. I think hopefully that is a good sign to people that nature and the environment can reestablish itself if we leave it and we let it go. So, this decade is the UN decade of the restoration. It's about planting trees. It's about making sure we understand that nature needs to have its space. So I think that hopefully building back better after COVID will be green growth. It'll be about planting trees. It'll about really taking climate change seriously. And I really do hope that COVID has reset ourselves a bit so that we will not be greedy and thinking around,
Yeah.
our own concrete human, involvement. It's more around we need to live in peace with nature.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wow, that's a very huge insight. Wow, thank you, Chris. Yeah, I think COVID-19 has already given us a lesson that the nature needs a break and we need to give it a break and we should live with nature, not against nature. Yeah. Um, yeah, because otherwise there will be more disasters and another pandemic coming again. And yeah, we're not prepared for it. And yeah, this all sorts of things will happen again. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the end of our podcast. But before we officially end our podcast, do you have anything you would like to say, like messages that you would like to say to our members?
No, only to all the people out there really thinking around the impact of climate change, but it's also around everything you do. So products you buy, things you do, just check it, make sure, try to think around where it comes from, what's happening. It's your behaviors around what do you how you talk about it, how you work with your local, governments, how you work with your local, stakeholders, your communities around, environment. It's about thinking around, that nature has to live in coordination or in peace with the communities. Otherwise, it's just not going to work, and we need to realize that. So everything we do in terms of our work, in terms of our life, in terms of the way we live, we have to think about this in a holistic picture and really thinking about nature as part of that. So I think that just make sure whatever you do, thinking around climate change and the environment is a really important part of that. So, but good luck.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, and I also believe that youth is the key for this. Yeah, to advocate for these issues. Maybe they can come up with innovations to replace the products that are environmentally hazardous. Yeah. So and gather with the communities, help act local, help those people in need. And yeah, so I encourage all of you to join our campaign, this World Earth Day campaign. Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing with us, Christophe, and thank you so much for joining us in our podcast, guys. And don't forget to join our campaign. You can repost your infographics, the infographics that we posted on your Instagram or Facebook story, and join our competition or join our photo challenge, of course. And or you can just advocate and talk about these issues to people around you so we can together restore the earth. Thank you and goodbye.
Sustainable minds, sustainable minds, sustainable minds with IPSF.